Hi Amy, so for this assignment I decided to go to the Burchfield Penny Art Center here in Buffalo. I have driven by this place so many times, but I've never had the chance to go inside and check it out. So that's what I did, and the first exhibition space that I went to happened to be about Charles E. Burchfield, who the museum is actually named after. And I was immediately driven by all his landscape and nature paintings that he's done, which range in a whole variety of styles from realistic to impressionistic to kind of more fantastical, whimsical with bright colors and movement. And I thought that was really interesting that one person could have so many different aesthetics in painting, and that's what made me go in and check it out further. So really quick, a little bit about Charles E. Burchfield. He was born in Ashtabula, Ohio, I think I'm saying that right, in 1893, and as I learned, he was a talented artist his whole life, from a young kid when he was taking art classes in school, and then he was really supported by mentors throughout his life, and his parents encouraged him, so that's what made him pursue arts as a career. And then in 1921, Burchfield moved to Buffalo, New York, and to work for a wallpaper company, and that's where he got married and started a family, and then spent the rest of his years painting. So what I thought was really interesting about this collection in general was his wide range in style and mediums. He has etchings and prints and thousands of sketches and journal entries and watercolor and oil paintings that have such a huge variety, and I think it's really interesting to tell someone's life story through their art, because I do really think you see this change in their personality and their personas as people. So the whole exhibit in general was really interesting, but I want to focus on one particular painting called Winter Solstice, and it's a watercolor painting that he did in 1920 to 1921, and I'm just going to pull up that painting, and this is it. So my first initial reaction, which I did write down, was that I thought it was a desert kind of western style just because of the style of the buildings and the horse carriages, and then I realized the snow on one of the buildings, and that's what made me kind of spend more time looking at this painting and figuring out the story that it's trying to tell. I hope you were able to see that, because I was really struggling adding pictures in this video, so I resorted to just turning the camera completely. So yeah, my initial reaction was that it was kind of this old western deserted desert type scenery, but actually it's not at all. It's the winter, and there's snow, and the pond in the background is frozen, and there's people skating on it, so that made me question the whole location of it. And the series is called the Ohio Works, so I think it's like of where he was growing up and spent like his youth in Ohio in the Midwest. So then I started to notice that the painting wasn't really complete, and that there are pencil strokes and parts left unfinished, especially the two horses in the front. One is painted in, but there are still pencils of where outlines of his other versions of the horses are, and one horse is completely unpainted. And that makes me think that he started the work on the top right corner, because the buildings and that part of the painting have the most detail and looks like the time spent on it. And then as he moved down and more towards the bottom of the painting, that's when he left it more uncompleted and with the pencils. And I'm still unsure of whether that was a creative decision or if it's just a painting that was just never finished unintentionally. And then as I look into this, I see that like the snow stops sort of where the bottom of the trees are, and that he didn't like finish the ground, and then that's why I thought it was a desert scene because of the yellow, but really it was just snow that's not painted in. And then I was looking at the trees and how they're whimsical, more impressionistic style than the rest of the painting. So I don't know if that's because that's not finished as well, or if that was just a style choice, but the trees remind me of other paintings of his that are more whimsical and impressionistic, and those have very similar styles, so it makes me think that maybe he was blending styles, or that's just how he depicted the nature in this particular painting. And then the more I looked at it, at this watercolor, the more I started to notice his choices in color and how the entire piece is pretty muted and rather monochromatic, especially compared to some of his other work. And it looks really similar to a gray, dreary winter's day that we might get here in Buffalo. And I think that's really interesting because that sets the time period as well. And then you see the name of the piece is the Winter Solstice, which is the shortest and darkest day of the year. So I think that like suits the whole aesthetic of it if he's trying to capture, you know, the season and the whole like not sensual, like your whole senses, the senses that you would get if you were in this like location. And then that made me pay attention to the lighting of the painting, and that if it's the darkest and shortest day of the year, you get that like really deep shadows in the painted horse, and also the buildings and like the doorways and the windows. You get those deep shadows and darkness. So I think he was really like trying to bring out like the sun was kind of at an angle towards setting, even though there's kids out still playing on the pond, like the short day, you know, it's probably early, but it's also dark. And then there's the lack of people in the painting, which could either be a creative choice not to include them, or because it's cold and the days are shorter and everyone's either inside or at home. So I think that kind of helps tell that whole story of the location and what's going on. And I like how it's of an everyday scene. I feel like it's exactly what he was probably seeing, and something that like any traveler through the Midwest might, you know, drive by or horseback ride by. And you can imagine the sounds of like the horses moving over snow and like hearing the children playing in the pond in the distance. And it's really like atmospheric. He really sets up the scene in his painting. And while I was there, at the museum, I was able to see his other landscapes with this similar aesthetic and part of the series of the Ohio works. And most of them include pictures of these old wooden buildings and the horses passing through, as though they are glimpses of what travelers would have seen going through like the American rural Midwest. And then here is the second painting that I am referencing to. And you can tell it's much darker with the lighting of the setting sun. But in this one, he does include a farmer, which I think is helping again to tell that story of everyday life in the rural Midwest, where probably most people were farmers, and these small towns with like surrounded by nothing but fields because they're supported by like small communities of farmers. And probably this is what a large stretch of the like rural Midwest looked like, was just these small buildings and then acres and acres of land and then like small clusters of buildings, and you would just pass through town from town to town like that. That's sort of the impression that I get as I was looking at all his landscapes and the sceneries of those. And I think it's like the way he plays with the lighting really sets that mood, and he does like different times of day and different seasons, and he captures like a whole year and also a whole day in the life of your average Midwesterner in a rural setting in rural America. So this really made me think about some artists that we talked about in class who also during the 1900s were drawing, like the mundane scenes with regular people, showing life as it was and nothing extravagant or out of the ordinary. I know some of the artists we talked about, some were more abstract than others, but they were all paintings of everyday scenes, like the art in the Ashcan School, or this painting that I thought of in particular, Sunday, Women Drying Their Hair on the Rooftop in New York City by John Sloan. And I just think it's because they painted like normalcy, like everyday scenes, nothing very out of the ordinary or uncommon. And I think that's exactly what Charles Burchfield does, but for rural America. So he's capturing these everyday scenes, everyday lives of what people in rural Ohio were seeing and the type of cities they were living in and the landscapes that they were seeing every day. And I think that's what he captures in these landscapes that he made. None of them are over idyllic or dramatic. There's no majestic coloring with that godly sun that we see in some of the earlier paintings we discussed, the landscapes from the 1800s, when they're attracting people to go out west and to like increase tourism. We see like these heightened colors and like that godly atmosphere, and it almost looks too good to be true, and you can just tell that maybe those landscapes were exaggerated or made especially beautiful. But I don't think that Burchfield does that. I think he really captures like the natural beauty of his environment, and I think you can tell that he does find beauty in nature and that he does think the aesthetic around him is beautiful, and he captures that so well in his paintings. And I think that's what's really interesting about this series of the Ohio works, is that we're again seeing what life looked like in another part of America, because we see a lot of paintings of New York City and the tenant housing and all these different ways of life, and here Burchfield is setting up a story, a scene, a whole aesthetic around rural Midwestern life, probably in Ohio, that I think a lot of Midwesterners could have related to as to what they were seeing in their everyday lives in the early 1900s. So yeah, I thought this class was really great, so thank you so much. And yeah, that was my analysis of Winter Solstice by Charles E. Burchfield. Thank you.